Well, it is good to see everybody tonight. Tonight we're going to, as I said, begin our study of Christian evidences. And tonight, in this first study, we're going to look at just a general introduction, and then we'll go into the first chapter of the study materials that we provided. And we're going to look at the first section of that first chapter, which talks about this idea of the many faces of unbelief. But to introduce our study, Christian evidences. This is a subdivision of a much larger system of study that is generally known as Christian apologetics. According to Oxford Dictionary, the definition of evidence is the available body of facts or information indicating whether a belief or a proposition is true or valid. So whenever we consider that definition with the term Christian inserted before it, we could say that the definition of Christian evidences is the body of facts or information indicating that Christianity and its tenets are true and valid. Now, where does this idea of Christian evidences fall under this umbrella of Christian apologetics? Well, first off, this term apologetics is a term that many of you may not be very familiar with. It's a term that is not used as extensively in this sense as it once was. Generally, whenever we think of an apology, what do we think about? I'm sorry, I've done something wrong, I want to make it right, I'm sorry. It's admitting a mistake or seeking to right something that we've done wrong. But this term actually comes from a Greek term, apologia. And this word first appears in the New Testament in 1 Peter 3 and verse 15. And here we find the Apostle Peter addressing some early Christians that were living in the Roman province of Asia Minor. They were suffering persecution because of their faith. And so he tells them, he says, "Sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an apologia." To give an apologia to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Now, when we look at that term in the King James Version, how does it translate that term? It says to give an answer. But then if we look at some of the newer translations, the more modern English translations, it translates this word defense. Be ready to give a defense of the things that we believe. It's been said that within this one verse, Christian apologetics is summarized. It says Christian apologetics can be summarized in two parts, and we see this both indicated in this verse. It says we see the objective reasons and evidence that Christianity is true and how it corresponds to reality, but also we see the communication of these truths to the world. So notice in this verse, Peter says that we always need to be ready to give a defense. That's the communication. To give an answer as to why we believe what we believe. Why do we believe in God? Why do we believe that Jesus is His Son? Why do we believe that the Bible is His inspired Word? And so, within this one verse, we see this concept of Christian apologetics summarized very well. It is the understanding of this body of evidence, the facts that are there supporting our belief system, and then it's communicating those facts to others. Now, our study is going to mainly focus upon the first part of that summary, that being what we refer to as Christian evidences. The facts. This body of evidence that we have that supports our beliefs. Now, for many years, and I think that we all probably understand this and recognize this, For many years, this was an area of study that was greatly neglected. Many of you, I'm sure, were raised during a time when you really didn't hear this subject spoken of. Most people, the majority of people, at least those who were raised in what's commonly referred to as Christianized nations or more advanced societies, they generally were brought up with an understanding that there is a God. And even those who did not claim to be Christian, they still accepted to a certain degree that there is deity. But over time, and really we could blame this on a lot of different things, and we'll see this more in our lesson next week, but really what has brought about so much skepticism in regard to God, the Bible, Christ, our faith, is this idea of being a free-thinking people. You may have heard of a man by the name of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine developed an ideology that he referred to as free thinking, but he also developed what he called the Age of Reason. He developed a book that was published, I believe, back in the 1700s, and due to his way of thinking, he developed this idea that unless we have hard evidence, and what we might refer to as sensory evidence, that which we can see, touch, taste, smell, feel, then we cannot base a belief system on it. We cannot believe anything to be fact unless we can use one of the senses that God has given to us to recognize it as true. But part of this also has come from the ideology that everything has to be based upon the scientific method. As people have become more educated, they've developed this concept of the scientific method. And in this, it states that all beliefs must be established in this way. First, by observation. We look at things. We determine an idea as to how we think things work. Then, we develop a skepticism about that. Meaning, we think this is how it works, but can we prove that this is how it works? And they say that then you must form a hypothesis. I think that this is how this works. I think that the earth was formed by God. Or on the scientific side, I think that earth was formed by a big bang at some point in the past. So they develop this idea, but they say that since human reasoning is faulty, since human reasoning has the ability to place assumption in the place of fact, then there must be some type of experimentation or some type of tests that have to be done in order to prove the validity of that understanding. And so we test that. And as I said, much of that comes back to, are we able to see it? Are we able to touch it? Are we able to taste it? Are we able to smell it? Are we able to determine in some, the term they like to use is in some imperial way. Meaning, is there some type of definite way of establishing that this is the truth?
So it would be basically tangible evidence.
Yes. There has to be some type of tangible, hard evidence there. Well, then, they say that after you do these experiments, then you go back and you assess everything. You look at the experiments that you've made, and then you have to see whether this idea is proven or whether it has been disproven. It's kind of like the TV show Mythbusters. I'm sure many of you have seen that. They take these myths and they test them out to see if it's the truth or not. Well, that's going by this scientific method. They develop an idea, they test it, they try it, they see if it's true or not. Well, so much of what we see today in the world around us in regard to beliefs is that if it cannot be established based upon the scientific method, that we cannot believe it. We cannot accept it to be a truth if it cannot be determined in this way. Well, by the scientific method, if through this testing and everything, this hypothesis proves to be correct, then it becomes what's known as an accepted law. It's believed to be the truth in that matter. Now, in looking at this, can you see where people would struggle to prove the existence of God using this method? Yes. It would be very difficult to prove the existence of God going simply off this scientific method. Now you stop and you think for just a moment, how would we prove that God created the world? How would we prove that God created the animals, that God created man? How would we prove that Jesus is His Son? How would we prove the miracles of the Bible? How would we prove that the Bible is God's inspired word? How would we prove that? By using one of the five senses. So now we're starting to see where this struggle becomes. We're starting to see why there are so many people that reject the tenets of Christianity because they say it can't be proven.
But doesn't nature itself, you just go out and look at the atmosphere, you look at the sky, you look at the ground. Man didn't create that.
No.
There's too much regularity, there's too much coordination, everything works together. There had to be a higher power than man.
That's right. That's right.
This thing here takes away the belief essence in it.
Right.
You know.
It removes the whole concept of faith.
Right.
Because what they say, they look at this and they minimize it just to the five senses. They don't add faith into that. They look at just those things that are human in nature, those human senses. And they remove this idea of faith from the equation.
Is this the same thing as Scientology that's down in Orlando? That's their headquarters?
No,
Same thing?
Scientology is its own religion. I mean, it's a religious belief that's based upon a variety of different scientific leanings. But what this is simply the way that man, for the last probably 75 to 100 years, has been taught this is the way that you determine fact. I mean, you go sit through just about any science class in any college or school today. You're going to be taught the scientific method. You're going to be taught these words hypothesis and testing and theory and law and all of these things. Because that's how we are being taught that this is how you establish truth. It's not based upon faith. It's based upon fact. Upon fact. But then coming back to this idea that I mentioned a while ago that Thomas Paine really promoted, this idea of free thinking. Is it true that God created man with free will? Yes. Is it true that God created man with the right to think for himself? Yes. That is a fact. You know, we see an example of this, and this is included in your book. There in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 15, you know, Joshua is speaking to the children of Israel, and he tells them, he says, you've got to make a choice. He said, you can go back and you can worship the gods that your forefathers worshipped in Egypt and in the wilderness. You can worship the gods of the heathen nations here in the land of Canaan. He said, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Now notice, he gave them a choice, but there was one choice that was not on the table. Can you tell what that was? Notice there was not a choice given that they could not believe in any God. Notice they were told, you're going to serve some God. You choose which one you're going to serve, He said, but we are going to serve the Lord. We are going to serve God. And there, notice he said, you can serve the gods of your forefathers if that's what you want. You can serve the gods of the Canaanites if that's what you want. You have the right to do that. You have the right to think and to choose for yourself. He says, or you can serve the one true God of heaven. He said, but we've decided who we're going to serve. We're going to serve the one that's proven himself to us time and time again. We're not going to go back and forth. So in this, we see an inherent understanding in man that we are to worship someone or something. You know, anthropologists have proven that there has always been an inherent worshipful nature in man. That man has always tried to place an emphasis upon another entity or a man or even on nature and the things of this earth. You go back and you look at even some of the most primitive cultures and you find that they had their own things that they were worshiping. Man was created by God, and most people agree that it is the spirit, that spiritual aspect that God has given to man that has caused man to have this inherent desire to worship. But in looking at this publication that I mentioned, The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, it ushered in an era of skepticism that we are still seeing in the world around us today. There were many of those who were professors at the collegiate level back in those days that really grasped onto this idea, especially those who were teaching subjects such as philosophy. They really grasped a hold of this idea of the age of reason. And what Thomas Paine advocated was reason instead of revelation. Meaning just because the Bible reveals it, that's not enough proof to believe it. We have to be able to reason it out. Meaning we have to have some type of evidence other than simply the statement from the revealed Word as we believe it to be. He said you have to be able to base this upon reason. And if you cannot reason this out, then it's not something that can be believed. And he developed the view that the Bible is simply an ordinary piece of literature. It was not inspired by the Holy Spirit, therefore it's not the Word of God. In fact, he was a religious skeptic that became more and more skeptical as he went through his life. When he died, he was pretty much on the level with an atheist. He had begun as a very religious person. But as he began to develop these ideas of reason and how reason has to be superior to, as he says, revelation, we have to be able to reason it out. We have to be able to prove it in some other fashion. But as I said, it's true. God has created us with the ability to choose. He's given us free will to believe whatever we want to believe. And I think the second paragraph in your book is where you find this. And I think it describes this so clearly. It says, freedom, however, always comes with responsibility. With freedom of choice comes the responsibility to think carefully, choose wisely, and act forcefully. Therefore, it is the responsibility of every human being to recognize, believe, and obey the truth. I think that's a very, very good statement. That since we have been given the ability to think, to reason, to rationalize, then it is incumbent upon us to consider all of these things very carefully, to come to a proper conclusion, or as this says, to recognize, believe, and obey the truth. And this comes back to this concept that, God is not going to accept ignorance as an argument. God has given us the ability to think for ourselves, to reason. He's given us the ability to understand the truth. So it's not going to be good enough to stand before Him in judgment and say, well, I just didn't understand. It was just too hard. It was beyond my comprehension. No, He's not going to accept that. But when it comes to this decision of belief, and really that's what it comes down to, we have to make a decision. Are we going to believe or are we going to reject? And whenever it comes to this decision of belief, we find that people in the world generally fall into one of 5 categories. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of our class period tonight. And those 5 categories, this first one's not included in your book, but I think it's very important that we touch on this at least. The first is a theist. The second is an atheist. The third is an agnostic. The fourth is a skeptic. And the fifth is an infidel. Now let's start by talking about this concept of a theist. Like I said, this is not included in your book, but I think it's important that we at least understand what this is. A theist is you and I. A theist is someone who believes in the existence of God. Now, that can be expanded to say that they could believe in the existence of one God, or they could believe in the existence of many gods. But this term theist is a believer, is one who believes in deity. But in this, we see that there are a variety of different subdivisions. You have what's called monotheism, which means that you believe in only one God. That would be like Christians, Jews, Muslims, those who believe in and worship only one God. They are considered monotheistic religions. Then you have what's called polytheism, which is a belief in and worship of many gods. Ancient Greece and Rome are excellent examples of this, with their many different gods and goddesses that they worshipped. But the main religion that is generally associated with polytheism today is Hinduism. Hinduism, which is centered mainly in India and certain areas of China, worships thousands of different gods. Thousands of different gods. But one thing that is interesting with Hinduism is they do not claim to be exclusively polytheistic. This is where it gets a little confusing, because there are some Hindu sects that worship only one God. There are some, as we'll see in some other descriptions here, that they believe in worshiping only one God at any given time. That you can jump around and worship however many you want to worship, but you're only to worship one God at any given time. So there's some differing practices among those who practice polytheism. But some of the main religions that we see that practice this, other than Hinduism, would be Chinese Taoism and folk religions in China. You have a religion in Japan known as Shintoism. You have Cuban Santeria. There's many of the traditional African religions. And generally we think of these more along the lines of of dark arts, black magic, religions such voodoo, hoodoo, Wicca, occult religions, things of that nature. Most of them will claim to worship multiple gods. The polytheism is then further divided as to how those individual deities are viewed. You have an area of thought that's known as henotheism. Henotheism is the belief that there could be more than one God, but that only one of them is to be worshipped. There's a religion in Asia known as Zoroastrianism, and they are a religion that practices this belief. There's another one that is known as Cathenotheism, and that is the belief that there is more than one God, but only one God is to be worshipped at any given time. And whenever you are worshiping that God is the supreme God for that time. Now, when you start worshiping a different God, then that God becomes the supreme God. but whichever one is being worshipped at that point, that is the supreme God. There's another one known as monolatrism. Monolatrism is the belief that there is more than one God, but you're only to worship one. That only one is deserving of worship. Another term that we may be a little bit more familiar with, at least those who have done much study in American history, is the term deism. Many of our founding fathers were followers of this area of thought known as deism. And it really had its origin in Europe, but it was brought over to the United States. And it's the belief that there is only one God, and it is the one true God of heaven that we worship. But the belief is that God created all things, but once He finished His acts of creation, that He has been completely separate from man, from all of His creation from that point forward. That God has never intervened in any way other than through just His providential care, the way that He set everything into motion. Well, as we know, this is not the case. And then another one, and this was one that I had never heard it described in this way, or at least with this term, but it is one that I think that we need to be cognizant of because it is one that is growing in popularity. It's one that's called autotheism. Autotheism is the belief that deity is an inner personal state of mind. And what that means is that every person is a God to themselves. There is not a supreme being, that we are all our own God. Buddhism is the prevailing group that believes this, but there's also some Hindus that believe this. But here is why I say it's important that we understand this. Mormonism has their own view of this. And they don't use the term autotheism. They use the term exaltation. And what they believe is that by living a faithful Mormon life, that you can, so to speak, at the time of your death, graduate to godhood. That you can become deity. And they believe that Jesus, at one time, was here just like you and I, and that He faithfully lived life, and He was elevated to the level of God. And what they believe, they take it so far as to say that once you reach this point that you obtain godhood, you're going to be given your own universe with your own subjects, and people are going to be serving you, worshiping you. Well, this is nothing more than autotheism. Now, there are some other radical forms of belief that are not as widespread, and they're ones that we're not as likely to encounter. So we won't really spend much time discussing those. But let's talk about the other side of the coin for just a moment. We've been talking about those who claim a belief system. But what about those who do not claim to believe? Well, first, as I mentioned, you have atheism. And if you look in your book, the definition that it gives is a very simple definition, and that is without God. Without God. Therefore, atheists believe that without a doubt, God does not exist. Now, in your book, there is a quote there from Carl Sagan, who was a very well-known atheist from past generation. But I found a quote that I want to share with you that I think more clearly explains this atheistic ideology. Some of you may remember back in April of 1961, there was a Russian cosmonaut by the name of Yuri Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to ever orbit the Earth. He went into orbit, and when he came back to Earth, he was being interviewed. And he made this statement. He said, "Ascending to outer space, I encircled the globe again and again. Aided by a powerful telescope, I scanned the sky, the region above and below and all around. And with all of my scanning, I did not see God." therefore there is no God. So you see the reasoning there. He said, I looked for him and I couldn't see him with my eyes. I even used a telescope and I couldn't see God. Therefore there is no God. Well, this shows the mentality of many atheists. And I've been using this terminology, this sensory ideology. Many atheists claim that if you cannot prove anything or whatever it is you're considering, if you cannot prove that based upon one of the five senses, then you cannot establish it as fact. It has to be rejected. However, as your book says, and I believe this wholeheartedly, it's much easier for someone to call themselves an atheist than it is for them to prove their position. You know, I've heard preachers make the statement all my life that it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a Christian. And as you consider this, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Because it takes so much speculation. So many different things that are there. Well, as the book says, in order to know that there is no God, a person would have to know every single fact in the universe. Because the one fact that he did not know might be the fact that God exists. Atheists cannot prove that God does not exist because no one can possibly know all things. We do not have the ability to know every fact that there is. But also, and I think the book makes a very good argument here, with many atheists, they really don't care about the fact so much. They really don't care about any kind of evidence to support their views. It's more an emotional response. And once again, we're going to talk about this more in next week's lesson when we start looking at some of the causes of unbelief. But so much of this is based upon emotion. And in your book, it mentions the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov. And he made the statement, emotionally, I am an atheist. I don't have the evidence to prove that God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect that He doesn't that I don't want to waste my time. That is a view that is very, very prevalent among atheists. Atheism does not and cannot answer the evidence that is there for God. They cannot make any type of a claim that their view is reality. They cannot offer any type of acceptable alternative to God. So much of this is based upon their emotions. Okay, we're going to stop there for tonight. Lord willing, next Wednesday night we'll pick up with agnosticism.